On October 17, 2006, some 5 years after 9/11, President Bush signed the Military Commissions Act of 2006 into law.
The recent Military Commissions Act of 2006 that was passed by Congress was a disaster for human rights, I think, from beginning to end. And if you look at what it did set up a second-tier system of justice that applies only to foreign nationals, that would allow into evidence that was obtained through cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or coercion, which isn't allowed into U.S. courts, which isn't allowed into U.S. military courts. It set up a very broad definition of who qualifies as an unlawful enemy combatant that takes away any notion of a combatant being attached to an armed conflict or a battlefield. It could be any person anywhere on the planet, absent an armed conflict, absent any association with an armed conflict. And that's a real concern, because what that does is that then eliminates the human rights framework entirely, and puts forth the idea that you can pick up any person, anywhere, anytime, and then hold them indefinitely pursuant to a vague law of war theory, when the law of war was an exceptional portion of the law that was intended to apply to an armed conflict.
The law expands the definition of combatant to include those who have purposefully and materially supported hostilities against the United States, even if they have not taken part in the hostilities themselves, and even if they are arrested far from the battlefield. An example could even encompass somebody who unknowingly contributed money to a charitable arm of a terrorist organization. These definitions have essentially been invented by the administration and Congress. They have no basis in international law and undermine one of the most fundamental pillars of the Geneva Conventions, the distinction between combatants who engage in hostilities and are subject to attack, and non-combatants.
The way that the Military Commissions Act of 2006 defines unlawful enemy combatant is clearly overbroad. It includes citizens, and it also includes individuals that provide material support to individuals that engage in aggression against or hostilities against the United States. Normally, military commissions are only used to try individuals in armed conflict, people who are brought in off the battlefield. That's the idea of what the appropriate use of a military commissions is. The idea that just an individual that's engaged in what is essentially a crime of, say, providing material support, which has its own problems as far as being a vague term. That's much more appropriate for perhaps a criminal court system, civil system, domestic system to be dealing with, not a military commission.
The bill also takes away the right to go to court for all detainees in U.S. custody, foreign nationals that are in U.S. custody. It strips those currently in custody of the right to file claims of habeas corpus, meaning just the basic and most fundamental protection of challenging their detention before a court, which essentially allows the U.S. government to continue to hold them arbitrarily. It also takes away the right to follow on any kind of follow-up claim. So there can be no reparations. There can be no claim made under the Alien Tort Claims Act, or claims for reparations for people who may have been arbitrarily detained and tortured. And so that in and of itself is a huge concern, just completely cutting the courts out of the picture. There's just so many pieces of the Act that really do cause concern, including parts that seem to offer retroactive immunity to people who may have been involved in war crimes, U.S. agents who may have been involved in war crimes.
The Military Commissions Act of 2006 extends these court-stripping prohibitions and makes them retroactive and applicable to non-citizens in U.S. custody anywhere in the world. The law even grants immunity to those who have committed torture before December 2005, thereby preventing justice from ever being pursued.
I think what it does that should be of great concern is one of the best protections against human rights violation is to have access to courts, access to judicial review, access to family and attorneys, to have some kind of outside check on the system. And by removing all of that, it creates a huge concern as to what's happening to people in custody, because they have no avenue to make complaints and they have no avenue to get their situation corrected. So if something is happening, nobody would ever know. And we've always known that secrecy is what surrounds some of the worst human rights violations.
One has to realize that you don't know if somebody has engaged in terrorism. You don't know that you're torturing a terrorist. You don't know that you're detaining a terrorist if that individual hasn't been able to explain themselves in full If that individual hasn't been given the opportunity to state why they're not a terrorist, why they haven't engaged in any hostility, why they are being unjustly detained, that process is really essential. I think that's really important to remember, that we can't say, well, it's clear that all the people being detained in Guantanamo are not terrorists. There are many innocent individuals who have been detained there, and that needs to be addressed. The idea of innocent till proven guilty is very core to civil liberties and human rights standards. Of course, organizations like Human Rights First believe that terrorists should be prosecuted, and we have a system for prosecuting terrorists, and we have prosecuted terrorists successfully within our own civilian court system, and we certainly encourage these types of prosecutions to continue. Terrorism is a violation of individuals' human rights. We condemn any acts of terrorism, and we believe that those engaged should definitely be prosecuted. But the due process of the justice system needs to be preserved.
We can all hope and pray that torture may soon be abolished worldwide. In my judgment, there's no higher calling than what you're doing here. Every member of Congress should be required to meet with victims of torture and to hear their stories firsthand.
But it's really each of us on the level taking on our conscience and to struggle and not to accept and to believe that torture and assassination can never be justified.